The beach lay quiet beneath the weight of night. The tide had slipped back, leaving behind a stretch of damp, glistening sand. For a long while, nothing stirred except the hush of waves and the distant call of seabirds settling in the dark. Then, near the crest of a dune, the sand shifted. It trembled once, then again as if something beneath pressed upward, searching for the surface. Tiny grains loosened, falling in trickles down the slope. A small, dark shape broke through, fragile and unsteady, its movements awkward against the heavy grains. Another followed and another still, until the sand seemed alive with motion. They came slowly, one after another, the hatchlings pushing their soft shells and flailing flippers against the earth that had held them for weeks. Each turtle was no larger than a child's palm. Their bodies, still glistening from the nest, bore the softness of new life. They struggled with each motion, their efforts labored and halting, yet they did not pause. The sand clung to their damp skin as they clawed forward, blinking into a world vast and unfamiliar. The night air held the cool scent of salt. The ocean, hidden in darkness, breathed steadily beyond the flat expanse of sand. Though distant, its pull was strong, a faint rhythm beneath the sound of the wind. The hatchlings paused often, resting in shallow dips of the beach, then pressed onward again. Each movement a quiet victory against exhaustion. The dune itself shifted slightly under their combined efforts, collapsing in tiny slides as more bodies emerged. A dozen soon became 20, and then more, a fragile wave of new life spilling from the earth. Some climbed over each other in their rush to escape, while others lingered at the edge of the nest, hesitant, their heads lifted to taste the cool air before stepping forward. Their path was uneven, marked by shallow trails etched in sand. Some moved with surprising swiftness, their flippers beating with instinctive urgency. Others faltered, toppling onto their backs before righting themselves again with desperate wriggles. Every gesture carried the raw weight of survival, not graceful but determined. From a short distance, two people stood in quiet awe. Their voices when they spoke were hushed, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile procession. "Look at them," one whispered, wonder soft in the tone. The other only nodded, keeping still, their eyes fixed on the tiny figures struggling toward the unseen water. The hatchlings did not pause for the watchers. Their world stretched only as far as the sand before them and the unseen horizon beyond. The scent of salt carried them forward, the faint murmur of waves giving direction to their slow, uneven march. Some strayed sideways, wandering off into darker patches of beach, where driftwood and shadows threatened to obscure them. A few lagged behind, lingering near the nest entrance, their movement slower, their energy fragile. Yet still they pressed onward. The sand around them was uneven, carved with ridges by the retreating tide. The smallest obstacles seemed like vast barriers. A shallow groove became a trench, a pebble, a boulder. Against each challenge, the hatchlings threw themselves with clumsy persistence, their fragile bodies trembling but refusing to yield. For those watching, it was a scene of quiet intensity. No sound rose except the shuffle of small flippers against sand and the endless breath of the tide. It was not dramatic, yet it was everything. A fragile beginning unfolding beneath the indifferent stars. The beach, moments before empty and still, now carried the delicate imprint of life newly begun. The sand stirred, and from it emerged a story as old as the ocean. Small lives, unsteady but unyielding, stepping into a world that waited with both peril and promise. The hatchlings moved steadily across the sand, their flippers leaving faint trails that shone silver under the moon. For a time, their direction held true, guided by the steady breath of waves calling from the shoreline. But beyond the dunes, faint against the night, a harsher light burned. Street lamps from a nearby road cast their glow over the beach, sharp and unwavering, brighter than the shifting glimmer of the sea. One by one, the hatchlings began to falter in their course. Instead of pressing straight toward the water, some veered sideways, turning toward the artificial glow. Their movements, once aligned, now split and scattered. The wide beach became a place of confusion, with trails branching out into the wrong direction. A group of hatchlings pressed toward a dark stretch of road. Their small bodies moved with the same determination as before, but every step carried them away from the safety of the tide. A few reached patches of dry grass, the stalks bending under their weight. Others became caught in shallow depressions where the sand gave way to gravel. Their flippers beat helplessly as they tried to climb free. The humans who had been watching felt their quiet awe give way to concern. One stepped closer, then knelt, their voice low. "Not that way," they whispered softly, almost as though speaking to themselves. The hatchlings did not heed the voice. Their small bodies pulsed with instinct, pushing them forward with no awareness of the peril that lay beyond the beach. The glow of the lamps pulled at them more strongly than the silver reflection of the waves. A single hatchling, slower than the rest, paused in the sand. Its head lifted as though sensing a choice, then it turned toward the false light. It moved with halting effort, its body trembling under the strain of distance. Behind it, the tide rolled on unseen, the ocean that had birthed it now out of reach. The humans exchanged glances, unease clear in their silence. One took a slow step forward, careful not to cast shadows over the tiny creatures. Their presence was gentle, almost hesitant, but the urgency lingered beneath. Another hatchling had already reached the base of the dune, climbing upward toward the glow of passing headlights beyond. The scene carried no noise but the rustle of dry sand under soft bodies. The turtles did not call or cry. Their confusion was visible only in their paths, in the way they turned toward danger with unyielding effort. The vulnerability of their small frames, barely strong enough to lift over a pebble, revealed how narrow the line of survival could be. One of the humans bent low, resting a hand lightly against the sand to steady themselves. They did not reach for the hatchlings, not yet. Instead, they simply murmured, "Keep going, little ones," their tone almost a prayer, though the turtles pressed on without pause. The scattering deepened. Dozens of hatchlings now moved in separate directions, some edging closer to the surf, others disappearing toward the lights. Their bodies left trails that branched like veins, a fragile map of both promise and risk written into the sand. The watchers could see what instinct could not. The balance was tipping. Without guidance, many would never find the ocean. Their journey, already perilous, was becoming a slow unraveling, and still, the night pressed on with indifference. The waves kept their rhythm, steady and patient, while the glow of the road spilled across the beach with no regard for the fragile lives below. Between these two forces, the hatchlings moved blindly, unaware of the choice that would decide everything. For a long moment, the people simply stood still, their eyes following the scattered trails across the sand. What had begun as quiet wonder now weighed heavily, each hatchling's misdirection carrying with it the sharp knowledge of how fragile this moment was. The glow of the road continued to draw the small bodies upward, pulling them toward danger. It was clear now that many would never reach the water without help. One of the watchers lowered themselves to the ground, pressing a palm gently into the cool sand for balance. They hesitated, careful not to disturb the fragile procession, then extended their hand close to the hatchlings, forming a barrier where the slope led toward the road. The tiny turtles met the edge of this quiet wall and turned, redirecting their effort without pause. Others began to do the same, shifting their course slowly toward the sound of the sea. The second person followed, stepping into place with deliberate slowness. Together, without words at first, they created a living boundary, not lifting the hatchlings, not forcing them, only shaping the path they might take. The turtles moved around the obstacles of human legs and outstretched arms, redirected with subtle care back toward the dim shimmer of the waves. Their flippers pressed into the sand with unrelenting rhythm, bodies rocking side to side as they climbed over small ridges and pebbles. The humans watched each motion closely, ready to shift if another strayed too far. Their breaths stayed low, their voices hushed. "Steady now," one whispered, though the words were more for their own nerves than for the creatures before them. The hatchlings did not falter. They simply pressed onward, their determination quiet and absolute. When one tipped onto its back, a hand reached down, not to grasp but to shade the sand, easing the effort as the tiny body wriggled itself upright again. The balance of respect remained, guidance without intrusion, presence without domination. More hatchlings poured from the nest, joining the procession already in motion. The beach, once scattered with confused trails, began to show a new pattern, a soft convergence. Dozens of tiny figures angled once more toward the ocean, their paths straighter now under the watch of gentle guardians. The night carried on with its own rhythm. The tide drew closer, whispering across the flats, and the air cooled with the promise of dawn still distant. Yet in this pocket of time, everything narrowed to the fragile procession of small lives. Each step forward seemed improbably significant. Each turn back toward the right direction a quiet relief. Occasionally, one hatchling still strayed, its body caught by the false glow beyond the dunes. A hand would lower into the sand again, forming a gentle shadow. The turtle would pause, then angle away, continuing its trek toward the low roar of water. The system was imperfect, yet it worked. The people shifted positions with care, forming a slow-moving line of protection. Their silhouettes bent and crouched, shaping the night into something safer, softer. Between them and the tide stretched a journey still uncertain, but less lonely than before. "Almost there," one murmured, voice carried away by the wind. The hatchlings pressed forward, their tiny bodies glistening in the faint light, their movements uneven but relentless. The sand seemed endless beneath them, yet the rhythm of the sea grew stronger, its pull unmistakable. And now, for the first time since their fragile emergence, the way toward life was clearer. The humans adjusted their stance on the sand, moving with a patience shaped by the fragility of the moment. They spread out slowly, not in haste but with intention, creating a quiet corridor between the scattered hatchlings and the tide. Their silhouettes bent and stretched, arms lowered to the ground, shadows cast long across the beach. In this softened line of stillness, the false glow from the road was dimmed, and the horizon opened again toward the sea. The hatchlings responded without hesitation. One by one, they angled away from confusion, their bodies shifting toward the rhythm that pulsed through the night. Their flippers pressed into the sand, pushing with effort that seemed almost too great for their size, yet they advanced with unbroken will. The procession, once scattered, began to take shape, a fragile current of life flowing through the human-formed channel. The night air carried the scent of salt more clearly here, the ocean's breath growing stronger as the tide returned. Each small body lifted and fell with uneven rhythm, shells glinting faintly as they pressed onward. Some paused, exhausted, their movements slowing until the sand nearly held them still. Yet the sound of water, steady and patient, pulled at them, urging them to begin again. The humans shifted carefully, closing small gaps in the corridor when a hatchling strayed too far. Their hands brushed the sand in quiet gestures, not touching but guiding, shaping subtle turns with their presence. Their faces, softened by shadow, showed neither triumph nor command, only focus, a steady awareness that each life before them balanced on the edge of chance. A murmur broke the silence. "Keep going, little one," one whispered, voice barely carried on the wind. The hatchling nearest to them stumbled over a ridge in the sand, its body tumbling sideways before finding balance again. It pressed forward without pause, as though the whisper had folded into the sound of the tide itself. The corridor became a passage of patience. Dozens of hatchlings now pressed onward, their trails weaving together in soft lines that converged toward the surf. The sand was etched with patterns of struggle and persistence, grooves carved by tiny bodies refusing to stop. From above, it looked as though the earth itself was being written upon, the script of survival drawn in delicate strokes. One of the smaller hatchlings faltered at the edge of the corridor, caught by the faint pull of light still lingering from the road. It angled outward, its path curving away from safety. The nearest human crouched low, their frame cutting the glow, casting a deeper shadow across the sand. The hatchling paused, then shifted back toward the ocean, its body swaying with fatigue as it rejoined the line. The tide drew closer, a faint froth spreading across the flats. The sound of waves grew louder, filling the corridor with a promise of arrival. The hatchlings seemed to feel it, their pace quickening despite exhaustion. Their flippers struck the sand with renewed urgency, though their bodies trembled under the weight of the journey. The humans remained still, holding their positions as guardians of the passage. The artificial light no longer dominated the hatchlings' vision. Now it was the sea that commanded their attention, its rhythm calling them forward in an ancient, unbroken song. For the first time since they had emerged from the sand, the way ahead was clear. The corridor of shadows had given them back their path, and the ocean waited. The sand grew darker and wetter as the hatchlings reached the edge of the shore. Their tiny flippers, worn from the long crawl, now struck against firmer ground, leaving faint imprints that the tide was already beginning to erase. The air changed here, cooler, heavy with salt, carrying flecks of spray that clung to their soft shells. Ahead, the ocean stretched vast and unbroken, its surface silvered by moonlight, its voice rising and falling with steady power. The first hatchling reached the line where water met sand. It paused as if gathering strength, then pressed forward just as the next wave rolled in. The water surged around its body, lifting it briefly before sliding back, pulling grains of sand from beneath its weight. For a heartbeat it seemed to struggle, flippers beating unevenly against the force, and then it slipped into the shallows. Carried a little farther with each retreating wave, another followed close behind, then two more. Each arrival was a repetition of the same fragile battle, the pause at the water's edge, the tremor of effort, the sudden sweep of the tide pulling them outward. To the people who stood nearby, every moment of contact carried both relief and ache, for each hatchling that reached the sea was stepping into a world no one could follow. The procession continued. Dozens of small bodies crossed the last stretch of sand, some tumbling in the foam, others pressed sideways before finding their way into the rolling shallows. The ocean accepted them without ceremony, its vastness swallowing their small forms in silence. Only the brief glint of a shell beneath the surface marked their passing. The humans remained still, their shadows stretching long across the sand. They did not move to touch the water or chase the hatchlings farther. Their role was done now. They stood only as witnesses, their faces softened by the dim glow of night. Their breath slow with the weight of watching something both fragile and immense unfold. "Safe travels," one murmured, so softly it nearly vanished under the hiss of the tide. The hatchlings kept coming. Those who had lagged behind finally reached the shore, dragging their bodies across the damp line where the waves stretched longest. Some seemed almost too tired to continue, collapsing briefly into shallow depressions, their movements weak. But each time the sea returned, its push and pull gave them a final surge forward, carrying them beyond the reach of land. The sand grew emptier with each passing wave. Trails, once sharp and fresh, began to blur as water swept over them. The small grooves that had told of struggle and persistence melted back into the smoothness of the beach. Soon, only faint markings remained, scattered between seaweed and shells. For those watching, the stillness that followed carried its own kind of weight. The chaos of misdirection and danger had passed. The fragile urgency of guiding hands had quieted. Now there was only the ocean, steady and eternal, holding within it the futures of those who had survived the journey. The last hatchling lingered near the edge of the surf, its small body rocking with exhaustion. A wave reached out and lifted it, tumbling it sideways before drawing it gently back. Its flippers stirred once more, faint but certain, and then it was gone, folded into the rhythm of the sea like all the others before it. The strangers stood together in silence. Their footprints pressed deep beside the fading tracks of the hatchlings. Behind them, the road lights still burned, harsh against the night, but the corridor they had formed had held true. Before them, the tide rolled on, carrying with it the memory of the night and the countless small lives that had passed into its care. The beach was quiet again, empty but for the whisper of waves, the air cool with salt and wind. The ocean stretched outward, endless and calm, as if nothing at all had happened, except for the faintest of trails now dissolving into blue.